Hello, I'm David Brown, and this is Echoes in Time. The USS Wahoo was commissioned at Mare Island Navy Yard in California on May 15, 1942, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Marvin G. Kennedy, with Lieutenant Richard H. O'Kane as executive officer. Now, Kennedy, a 1930 U.S. Naval Academy graduate, was an experienced submarine officer whose previous assignment was as executive officer of the USS Narwhal. Narwhal was one of the V-boats designed, submarines in the late 1920s, and it was a lumbering beast compared to the new Gattos and the later Baleo class. Interestingly, O'Kane, a 1934 U.S. Naval graduate, also came to Wahoo from another V-class boat, the USS Argonaut. There he'd spent about 4 years, was well trained in every aspect of submarine operations. So following her sea trials and initial training along the California coast, Wahoo departed Mare Island on August 12th for Pearl Harbor, arriving 6 days later on August 18th. Just 5 days after Wahoo arrived, she got underway on her first war patrol, where she was ordered to search and destroy Japanese shipping in the waters just west of the Japanese stronghold of Truk. Much to Executive Officer Lieutenant O'Kane's dismay, Kennedy would prove to be a less than aggressive and somewhat overly cautious captain. Kennedy would repeatedly fail to press home any attack that fell outside of what is now considered the obsolete pre-war doctrine. According to O'Kane, Captain Kennedy had a number of odd eccentricities too. Though Wahoo could distill up to 350 gallons of fresh water a day, mostly for the batteries, cooking, drinking, etc., Kennedy did not permit the crew to use this water for bathing. Wahoo, like other fleet boats of the day, had air conditioning, partly for the crew comfort, but more to reduce the humidity inside the submarine and also to keep the numerous electronic systems from overheating. Now, Captain Kennedy ordered that buckets be placed underneath the air conditioners to capture the fresh water produced by the condensers cooling the air. The crew was to use this and only this water for bathing. This procedure, it could not even begin to produce enough fresh water for even the most basic hygienic practices, and O'Kane would later note that the crew's morale suffered greatly. When a submarine was operating at night, much of the normal illumination was turned off and reduced with red lights throughout the boat. The red lights helped preserve a crewman's night vision, allowing them to see better in the dark, as, say, if they were on lookout duty or on the bridge at night. This was later replaced with red lens goggles. And according to Admiral O'Kane, Captain Kennedy ordered that most of Wahoo's normal lights be removed and the entire submarine be rigged for red at all times, with only just a few traditional lights in spaces where it was absolutely necessary. The officers and the men had no idea what to make of their new skipper. Kennedy seemed intent on making what was already a dangerous and difficult duty even more so, with practices that increased the crew's hardship and to them made little to no sense. Many of the veteran enlisted men had never seen anything like this before. On September 20th, 1942, Kennedy attacked what was identified as a 6,400-ton Japanese freighter escorted by a destroyer. Wahoo fired 4 torpedoes at the freighter and heard one hit. The destroyer countered, attacked, dropping dozens of depth charges, but Wahoo managed to evade submerged by hiding in a rain squall. Kennedy believed the freighter sunk and was given wartime credit, but post-war analysis of the Japanese shipping records by the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee, known as JNAC, showed no sinkings at that time and at that place. On October 3rd, Kennedy failed to press home an attack on an unescorted Japanese seaplane tender, the Chiyoda. Then, on October 5th, Wahoo sighted a Japanese aircraft carrier being escorted by 2 destroyers. Kennedy made another overly cautious approach on this, an ideal submarine target, but was unable to reach a firing position. The unidentified aircraft carrier sailed away, never even having known Wahoo was there. Wahoo returned to submarine base Pearl Harbor for refit on October 17, 1942, with a single claimed sinking. and during her refit, the 3-inch deck gun was removed and replaced with a far more capable 4-inch gun, and 2 Oerlikon 20mm cannons were installed, one on the main deck behind the sail and one on the forward deck. O'Kane would later write that the crew's morale could hardly have been lower. I can't substantiate that because there's very little that is said in popular culture in reference to this. But by his impression, they had a fine ship and a deep desire to take the fight to the enemy. But their captain lacked aggression to press home an attack, and his day-to-day idiosyncrasies in running the boat only seemed to deepen this. Captain Kennedy himself acknowledges that he may not be the man for the job in Wahoo's patrol report, though he initially places blame on the crew when he writes, and this is on page 18 of the first report of the USS Wahoo. After sighting various small craft, suddenly, on the 5th, there came into view the Ruyo, heading for the Empire. Had I but required a more rigorous and alert watch, we might have picked her up sooner. Now, Wahoo clearly saw what looked like the aircraft carrier, but it could not have been Ruyo. Ruyo had itself actually been sunk in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons by U.S. aircraft 2 weeks earlier. He then shifts responsibility to himself. Had I correctly estimated the situation and made a more aggressive approach, we might have gotten in a shot. Had I taken up a surface chase without allowing over an hour to elapse, we might not have lost the target. And had I continued to search through the rain squalls until dark, we might have picked her up again. None of these happened, and the target proceeded unharmed. Then, like he didn't just bear responsibility and saying everything that he did wrong, he then continues, and this still on page 18 of the Wahoo's first patrol report, in studying over both approaches, I find they conform to the normal method of attack, and confronted with the same situations again, the results would probably be identical. In all of the patrol reports I have read, these are the oddest entries I have ever seen. Kennedy, in effect, acknowledges his mistake, then admits if he was given another chance, he would do the same thing again. It's simply bizarre. One cannot help but be sympathetic with the officers and men of Wahoo who were just champing at the bit to get into this fight, only be commanded by a captain who seemed intent on holding his opponents at arm's length, even to the point of acknowledging as much in his own patrol report. Everyone anticipated getting a new skipper for their second war patrol. While this did not immediately lift morale, it did give them some hope. But this was soon dashed when, following the refit at Pearl Harbor, Captain Kennedy returned aboard Wahoo to command her for the second war patrol. XO Dick Kane, in his own words, later wrote, "Properly, I should have gone forward to greet him. Improperly, I bounded up the messroom ladder and made a beeline for headquarters." This is from his book, Wahoo, The Story of America's Most Famous Submarine, on page 70. O'Kane met with Commander Joe Grenfell, the Submarine Squadron 4 Chief of Staff. Grenfell had previously commanded USS Grungeon on her first war patrol just after Pearl Harbor and sank a Japanese submarine. In his book about Wahoo, O'Kane writes he expressed deep concerns as to whether Wahoo can endure another patrol under Kennedy's command without a total collapse of morale. Grenfell explained to the commander that Commander Kennedy and Admiral Brown, the submarine squadron commander, were old friends, and as such, Brown wanted to see his friends succeed. Grenfell was powerless to help. There's nothing he could do for O'Kane with his difficult captain. But what he could do was assign a PCO, or prospective commanding officer, closer to Kennedy's rank to ride along on Wahoo for this qualification patrol. Perhaps having someone of near equal rank, though not of equal authority, along, might help alleviate the mounting tension between captain and first officer. And I honestly believe, after having read some of the popular literature on it, the greatest difficulty was really between an aggressive first officer and a less than aggressive captain. But hopefully this would be someone Kennedy might feel comfortable turning to for advice or suggestions. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Walker Morton was a 1930 U.S. Naval Academy graduate, born in Owensville, Kentucky, and raised in Florida. He reported aboard Wahoo as her new PCO the very next day. In the words of Dick O'Kane, his large square jaw and prominent mouth resembled that of Mush, a character in the Moon Mullins comic strip. The upperclassmen at the Naval Academy had dubbed him Mush, but that was quickly shortened to Mush, a nickname used by seniors and contemporaries, but only Dudley, never Mush, was heard on board Wahoo. Wahoo, The Patrols of America's Most Famous Submarine by Richard H. O'Kane, page 76. If you ever want to look that up. On a personal note, the first reference I can find to a widely accepted belief that junior officers or even enlisted men addressed Lieutenant Commander Morton as Mush comes from Forrest J. Sterling's 1960 book, The Wake of the Wahoo. This has since been repeated over and over again through popular reference by a number of writers and scholars. Now, admittedly, I wasn't there, and I can never say for sure whether this did or did not happen. But I can say this, as someone who served in the military for many years, I personally cannot imagine any situation in which this would have been an acceptable practice. Any chain of command requires a certain level of formality. The military couldn't function without it. And even throughout all of the conversations I had with Admiral Kane, I addressed him just as that, Sir or Admiral, even though by the time I talked to him, he was long since retired. It just never occurred to me to do otherwise. So you'll forgive me, but I am therefore a little dubious that members of the crew, enlisted or commissioned, ever addressed Lieutenant Commander Morton so informally. If anyone has any verifiable information to the contrary, please let me know in the comments sections below, because I'd be interested in reading them. On November 8, 1942, Wahoo departed Pearl Harbor for the Solomon Islands and her second war patrol. O'Kane later writes that the mood on Wahoo had lightened somewhat. Whether it was the presence of Lieutenant Commander Morton or that Wahoo had been given a patrol area that was sure to produce targets of value to Japan, well, that's kind of a subject of debate. Whatever the cost, the officers and crew, by all accounts, seemed to be adapting to Kennedy's ironclad command style. Most, that is, with the exception of her XO, Lieutenant O'Kane. According to O'Kane, Captain Kennedy seemed almost intent on verbally chastising him at every opportunity, and often in front of the men. Kennedy would also dismiss most of his XO's suggestions outright without even giving them the consideration they properly deserved. Now, as executive officer, O'Kane is the natural conduit between the captain, the crew, as well as the overall condition of the submarine, and as such, it's his duty to offer opinions or suggestions in all aspects of operation, up to and including attacks that the captain might consider. But Kennedy was not that kind of captain. Kennedy's orders as captain of the Wahoo were absolute, and not to be questioned or amended. To do so was tantamount to insubordination. This both frustrated and angered O'Kane in equal measure. He rightfully felt that Captain Kennedy's iron leadership style greatly reduced Wahoo's fighting effectiveness, and I do believe he was correct. Kennedy, on the other hand, and by all accounts, deemed O'Kane to be brash, impulsive, even to the point of recklessness. Still, this was a new day and a new patrol, and O'Kane was determined to push ahead as best he could, and perhaps with Lieutenant Commander Morton on board, things were bound to get better. Wahoo arrived in her patrol area near Bougainville and Buka Island on November 20th, 1942. At 20:30 hours on a dark and stormy evening of November 30th, Wahoo's lookout spotted smoke on the horizon. Wahoo had her first contact on this, her second war patrol. From Wahoo's patrol report, it reads, "At 20:40 hours, a brilliant light flashed, revealing the source of the smoke. A high-hull, low-superstructure vessel of considerable size, giving the appearance of a lightly burdened freighter or transport. The angle on the bow, 10 degrees starboard at a range of 6,000 yards. A destroyer escort was on station on the port bow, and we dived. At more than 3 miles distance, on a dark and stormy night, Wahoo could have easily tracked the ship from the surface unseen. It had been done before, and it was done many times after. Then she could have easily dived at dawn and moved in for an attack submerged. But Captain Kennedy, as he did on the first war patrol, chose to follow the obsolete pre-war doctrine of diving and trying to approach by sound. Using this method, Wahoo was never able to reach a firing position, and another enemy vessel continued on its way. On December 7th, 1 year after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Wahoo received a message that a large tanker in their patrol area had been seen headed towards Truk. Wahoo picked up the convoy on radar at 0220 on December 8th at a range of about 18,000 yards. It was the large tanker reported and an escort zigzagging at a speed of 18 knots. Wahoo was in a fine position for an attack on this highly prized enemy vessel, and at 10,000 yards, Wahoo dived. When the sound man suddenly called out echo ranging on the starboard quarter or the right rear of the submarine, the sound report, however, was incorrect. The echo ranging was actually coming from the port bow, or left front, 180 degrees difference, meaning nothing was coming up behind Wahoo as the sound report would have indicated. Commander Morton called out the error, but Kennedy didn't hesitate and ordered the negative tanks in the bow flooded and take Wahoo deep. The attack was over before it even begun. Wahoo would never be able to return to periscope depth in time to launch her torpedoes on the tanker, and with the tanker's speed of 18 knots, there's very little chance she could ever overtake her on the surface. Now, we will never know if Captain Kennedy heard Morton's correction of the sound man bearing and dove the ship anyway to avoid making the attack. I find that highly unlikely. Or, what I do find likely is he acted swiftly in accordance with the information he had. But no matter the case, the result would be the same. The Empire would get its oil and fuel, and Wahoo would get to sail away once again empty-handed. At 3 p.m. on December 10th, Wahoo encountered a 3-ship convoy being escorted by a Japanese destroyer. The actual destroyer was a Sashio, I believe is how you pronounce it, but if I'm wrong, I'm sure somebody's going to let me know. He originally intended to attack the destroyer first, leaving the convoy defenseless, but the destroyer would pass too close for the torpedoes to arm at 300 yards. The torpedoes wouldn't arm until they had made a run of at least 400 yards. Kennedy immediately switched targets to the largest freighter in the convoy and fired 4 torpedoes. 3 were hit, and Wahoo lined up for a shot on the next freighter, 300 yards astern of the first. But before Wahoo could launch her stern torpedoes, the destroyer escorting the convoy charged in, likely following the wake of the first torpedoes back to the sub. Wahoo went deep, and for the next 2 hours was subjected to no less than 40 depth charge attacks from the destroyer. Finally, at 17:30, Wahoo crept back up to periscope depth in time to see the large freighter slip beneath the waves. Captain Kennedy had guided his submarine through a perfect attack and subsequent evasion. The crew was elated, but many of the officers were still a bit skeptical. Had Wahoo finally turned the corner to being the ship of war everyone thought she could be, or was this attack simply a one-off not to be repeated? Only time would tell. At 02:30 on December 12th, Wahoo, running on the surface, picked up a large freighter zigzagging wildly. Likely having been informed of Wahoo's previous attack that an American submarine was in the area, Wahoo was on the port beam, or left rear of the freighter, and due to excellent visibility, Captain Kennedy chose to track it from a distance of about 10,000 yards. After 30 minutes observing the freighter, a mean course of 020 was determined with a speed of about 13 knots. O'Kane calculated if Wahoo were to get into position for a dawn periscope attack, she would need to dash ahead on all 4 engines. When he brought this to Kennedy's attention, the captain dismissed him angrily. All the crew could do was watch as another target slipped beyond the horizon. No ships were sighted for the next 2 days until December 14th at 8:15 when a clearly marked Japanese hospital ship came into range. In accordance with international law, the ship was allowed to proceed unmolested on its way, never even having known Wahoo was there. At 13:20, Yeoman Sterling, on sound, picked up an unusual surface noise that sounded like hail slapping the water. The duty officer, Payne, making a quick periscope observation, spotted a Japanese submarine running on the surface at just 3,000 yards distance. Wahoo immediately went to general quarters, and Captain Kennedy arrived taking the scope. Positively identifying the Japanese as an I-class submarine, at this range, Wahoo would have just enough time to swing and fire. Bringing her bow tubes to bear, less than 7 minutes after spotting the enemy warship, Wahoo loosed a spread of 3 torpedoes at a range of less than 800 yards. The first torpedo hit with a tremendous explosion just in front of the Japanese submarine's conning tower. The enemy never had a chance, as the sub immediately began sinking. 2.5 minutes after, the whole crew of Wahoo could hear the enemy submarine's pressure hull collapse with an explosion that was even louder than the torpedo's detonation. While Wahoo received wartime credit for the sinking of the Japanese submarine, post-war JNAC, again, could find no record of it. This is, I believe, at least one more instance in which JNAC got it wrong. There had been too much evidence. Too many had seen the submarine and heard it breaking up as it sank. Add to this, the Japanese High Command destroyed a huge number of documents before the end of the war, and it seemed not only likely, but very possible that this report of the loss of one of their submarines could very easily have been one of them. On December 19th, Wahoo turned for home. Only this time, she would be going to Brisbane, Australia, and not returning to Pearl Harbor. They had sunk one enemy freighter, for which they received a depth charging for, and a Japanese submarine. But there had also been a number of missed opportunities that, if pursued, would have made a good patrol great. Wahoo would get one more chance when on December 21st at 1650 hours, they picked up smoke on the horizon of an approaching enemy ship. Wahoo was in a fine position for an attack, even though the ship itself had not yet been identified. Captain Kennedy made a single periscope observation and then turned to the charts. After a few minutes, he ordered Wahoo secure from battle stations. Kennedy had determined that Wahoo had passed 10 miles into the submarine groper's assigned area. Now, what difference that made has anyone's guess. Here was an enemy ship, and it was Wahoo's job to sink it. O'Kane was furious and was about to object in a manner that would have likely gotten him confined to his cabin or worse, court-martialed for insubordination, when he was silently signaled by Lieutenant Commander Morton, standing behind Kennedy, to just let it go. O'Kane begrudgingly checked his anger, held his tongue, knowing Morton was right. With that, Wahoo resumed course for Brisbane, arriving the day after Christmas. She docked alongside the submarine tender Sperry, officially ending her second war patrol. On the last day of December 1942, command of Wahoo passed from Lieutenant Commander Kennedy to her new skipper, Lieutenant Commander Dudley Walker Morton. It is often said by writers and historians alike that Kennedy was relieved of command, which it implies that he committed some indiscretion or violation of the rules that somehow warranted his removal. To me, history has not been just to Kennedy in this way. In 1942, we had seen tremendous defeats with only just a handful of victories for the Allied powers. Japan had pushed south and east, conquering one of the largest empires in human history. And until America could fully unleash its massive industrial capability, see more men trained, and more submarines built, the Navy needed aggressive sub-skippers that were willing to throw their ships in harm's way and carry the fight to the enemy. Men like Morton, O'Kane, and Eugene Fluckey, just to name a few. Commander Kennedy was not that guy. Kennedy would go on to serve as repair officer on the submarine tender Bushnell, and later as commanding officer of the Fletcher-class destroyer USS Guest. Kennedy served with distinction off Guam, the Palau Islands, and during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. So while the term relieved is technically correct, perhaps reassigned is a more apt description. But no matter how you define it, Wahoo had a new skipper, one the officers and crew, and indeed the Navy, hoped would fill the directive to conduct unrestricted submarine war against Japan. but it would be a few more weeks while Wahoo was resupplied, minor repairs were made, and some much-needed rest for the crew. Following the completion of their refit, Wahoo departed for her third war patrol in the first half of January 1943, a patrol that has become steeped in both legend and controversy. The Japanese Navy and the Japanese Merchant Service were about to be introduced to a fighting submarine and a crew prepared to risk all hazards and pass up no opportunity to put enemy ships on the bottom. For Echoes in Time, I'm David Brown. Thanks for watching.